we're going to conclude a wonderful lineup of international films with a lecture and discussion about the 1974 Urdu film Garm Hawa, the first South Asian film to be featured in SMU's film festival. So we're excited for our entrance into the International Film Festival here. I hope that many of you have already watched the film, which I know many of our students did together prior to this event, safely distanced and outside, which is based on a short story by Islamic. Garm Hawa addresses the plight of Muslims in a newly independent Indian nation where their priorities were questioned and their credit vanished overnight. The film tells the story of those Muslims who did not move to the newly created state of Pakistan after the partitioning of India and Pakistan in 1947, but instead remained in India. Garm Hawa remains one of the most poignant films ever made on India's partition, and it's often credited with pioneering a new wave of art cinema in India. It's considered a landmark of what's often referred to as Indian parallel cinema. Though the film was set shortly after partition and it was released in the 1970s, it remains relevant on the subcontinent today, and I think a lot of you will be talking about that. I'd like to thank the World Language and Literature Department for putting on the International Film Festival and again inviting a South Asian film into the mix, and the Indian Students Association and Muslim Students Association for sponsoring the lecture and discussion of tonight's film. It's with great enthusiasm that I welcome Dr. Sadaf Jaffer to discuss Garm Hawa with us this evening. Sadaf Jaffer is a scholar with research interests in Islamic, South Asian, and gender studies. Her current book project, entitled Secularism, Sexuality, and Islam, Islamic Indian Muslim Progressivism, elucidates alternative Muslim subjectivities through the lens of a prominent Urdu writer and cultural critic. Jaffer is currently a postdoctoral research associate in South Asian Studies at Princeton University, where she teaches courses on Islam, South Asia, and South Asian American Studies. Prior to this appointment, she served as a postdoctoral fellow in global studies at Stanford University. Jaffer has published a paper in the Journal of Women's History entitled Women's Autobiography in Islamic Societies Towards a Feminist Intellectual History, in addition to posts on the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Huffington Post. She earned her bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and obtained her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University with a secondary field of studies in women, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Jaffer recently completed 2 terms as mayor of Montgomery Township, New Jersey, and in January 2019, she became the first South Asian woman to serve as mayor of a municipality in New Jersey and the first Muslim woman to serve as mayor of a municipality in the US. She was recently elected to serve on the board of trustees to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. So you can see why she's a perfect guest for a film festival themed resistance and great works of international cinema. So welcome, Dr. Jaffer, and I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really proud to be here this evening with you all to discuss such a powerful film. And I will be placing it in context of the work of Isma Chugtai. So the story for Garm Hawa was written by Isma Chugtai, who's a subject of my current book project. And you'll see the way in which this work fits into her broader perspective on resistance and that of the progressive writers movement to which she belonged. So again, I'm Sadaf Jaffer, and I'm a researcher and lecturer in South Asian Studies at Princeton University. And I'm honored to speak with you tonight and provide some context to the film Garm Hawa. My current book project centers on the Indian Muslim writer and cultural critic Isma Chugtai, who lived from 1911 to 1991. She's well known for being tried for obscenity in 1946 over the publication of her short story Lihaf, or The Quilt. After the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, Chugtai remained devoted to articulating a place for Indian Muslims in India rather than in Pakistan, to which many of her colleagues and family members had immigrated. She remains the most prominent woman novelist in the Urdu language, and yet she remains critically understudied. She also wrote the story for Garm Hawa. As this event is co-sponsored by the Indian Students Association and the Muslim Students Association, I think one of the most pertinent questions for this evening is, and a question that Garm Hawa really asks us to explore is, what is the place of Islam and Muslims in post-partition India? In her 1952 essay, From Bombay to Bhopal, Isma Chugtai recounts an episode that occurred as she was riding on a train with a group of fellow progressive writers en route to a conference. While they played rummy to pass the time, the train pulled past the shrine of the 13th century Saint Haji Malang, whose shrine sits on a plateau beneath the steep cliff. Like much of the landscape of rural India, the hills around Mumbai are dotted with shrines which draw devotees from India's multitude of religious communities. With characteristic humor, Chugtai recounts her group's conversation about the fate of the shrine as a symbol for Indo-Muslim practice in the new climate of post-partition India. A colleague asks playfully, quote, "Do you think these venerable saints have conferences? If there were a conference, what would they talk about? What problems would they have?" End quote. Chugtai jokes that they would probably complain that people weren't giving them enough offerings, and that attendance after many of India's wealthy Muslims moved to Pakistan was waning. Her colleague replies, quote, "So why don't these saints head off to Pakistan then too? After all, they are able to do everything. They are able to fill the whole world of wishes," end quote. Here, Chugtai forcefully asserts that there will be a continued place for Islam in India, retorting, quote, "How can you say this? India is a secular state. Religious tolerance will persist here. Muslims will have the right to freely construct as many shrines to Haji Malang as they want to build," end quote. The use of a shrine as a symbol of secularism and toleration might seem contradictory, and it's worth remarking. In Chugtai's text, the lived practice of the diverse followers of shrines like Haji Malang Sharif stand in stark opposition to the rigid boundaries of religious communalism. Though Haji Malang is a shrine to a Muslim saint, the hereditary right to conduct its festival belongs to a Brahmin Hindu family, and devotion to the saint transcends religious boundaries. The Indian progressive writers movement of the 1930s and the 1940s focused on collective action towards the cause of social and economic justice rather than civilizational restoration, as some of the other Muslim writers at the time were focused on. According to the manifesto of the group, written by Mulk Raj Anand, quote, "We believe that the new literature of India must deal with the basic problems of our existence today, the problems of hunger and poverty, social backwardness, and political subjection. All that drags us down to passivity, inaction, and unreason, we reject as reactionary. All that arouses in us the critical spirit, which examines institutions and customs in light of reason, which helps us to act, to organize ourselves, to transform, we accept as progressive." The progressives seized on earlier figures like Ghalib and Kabir as literary predecessors, perhaps due to the underlying humanism of their work. Indeed, the progressives even referred to themselves as the most worthy guardians and inheritors of ancient literature. At the first All India Writers' Conference in Jaipur in 1945, a Bengali linguist and participant in the progressive writers movement, Dr. Muhammad Shahidullah, attested to the writer's ability to transcend religious difference by saying, quote, "I know Hindu literature derives its vision from the Vedas. I know that Muslim literature derives its vision from the Quran. But in all religions, there is a relative unity, a common factor of truth. And if we keep that before our eyes, I think we can rise above the pettiness which dominates or paralyzes our literatures. We must swear by a religion of humanity. Whether a man is Hindu or Muslim is a question of personal religion," end quote. Here we see the influence of both the Islamic tradition of humanism and that of the religion of humanity. For Chugtai, one of the most pernicious effects of bringing religion into the public sphere was the communalism that surrounded partition. Chugtai engaged creatively with the subject of partition on a number of occasions, including her story for the film Garm Hawa, the film for which she received much critical acclaim, including the President's Award for Best Film Story. She wrote this story in response to a request from the film writer Shama Zaidi. Garm Hawa tells a story of an Indian Muslim family's plight after partition, and it opens with a poem by Kefi Azmi, read as images of Gandhi's assassination are shown on the screen. Azmi's poem highlights the message that all suffered equally from the violence around partition. Quote, when the country was partitioned, hearts were torn asunder. In every breast a storm. It happened here just as it did there. And this is in Urdu. It's Taqsim hua mulk, to dil ho gaye tukre, har sine mein tufan, wahan bhi tha, yahan bhi. So this wahan bhi tha, yahan bhi is the refrain in all of the couplets. So, in every house, funeral pyres burned. The flames blazed up in every city crematoria. It happened there just as it did here. No one listened to the Gita. No one listened to the Quran. It was as though faith itself was stunned. It happened there just as it did here. That final verse in particular, which claims that during partition, no one listened to the Quran or the Gita, contrasts communal violence that is said to be in the name of religion, and says that that is actually in the opposite spirit of the real underlying message of religion. In the film, Salim Khan, the owner of a shoe manufacturing company, and despite the fact that many of the Muslims in his city, including Salim's own brother and sister, moved to Pakistan, he decides to stay in Agra. This decision is buoyed by the need to care for his aged mother who refuses to leave her ancestral home. Tragedy after tragedy strikes the family. Their business collapses due to the unwillingness of moneylenders to give loans to Muslims who it was feared could potentially abscond to Pakistan. They lose their home when the property is deemed abandoned because the deed to the house was under the name of Salim's brother who left for Pakistan. Their son Sikandar is unable to find work. Yet the most tragic aspect of the film relates to the love and marriage prospects of Salim's daughter Amina. After being jilted by two lovers, both of whom abandon her and migrate to Pakistan, she kills herself in the most dramatic scene of the film. Salim's utter dependence upon fate and upon God's will to protect the family and lack of action to do something to help them is a site of ridicule in the film. At every painful turn, the viewer finds Salim seeking refuge in God and saying that something good will come out of whatever happens. The film's most striking example of the wrongheadedness of this mentality is when his daughter receives news that her second love interest has abandoned her. Salim says, quote, something good must come of this for our daughter, end quote. Almost as a direct retort to this blind faith, the next scene is the one in which she commits suicide. This act is the ultimate rejection of Salim's philosophy. What could possibly be good about his daughter's suicide? In my reading, his resignation to faith alone is deemed to be the reason that his family is abused and ultimately leads to his daughter taking her own life. The film calls for action to end suffering and work towards social justice by pointing to protest as the only legitimate way to ameliorate the family's situation. At the very end of the film, after all the tortures that the family endures, Salim agrees to move to Pakistan. Yet on the way to the railroad station, his son Sikandar jumps off the horse carriage to join a protest. Salim does the same and sends his wife back to their home. They abandon their plan to immigrate to Pakistan, instead remaining in India to fight for their rights as citizens of the new nation. Here, the didactic message is clear. The Khan family is treated unfairly due to their religious affiliation, and action must be taken to combat that injustice. The prescribed action is not to refine themselves in a pious way, but to protest against social inequality in India. Garm Hawa was not Chughai's only work to deal with the struggles that faced Indian Muslims after partition. It's often claimed that Garm Hawa is based on Chughai's story Choti Ka Jora, and though it does have elements of that story, it bears a much stronger resemblance to her short story Jare, or Roots, which was written in 1952. This story revolves around two neighboring families who are intimately entwined in each other's lives. As the narrator tells us, quote, Rukchand was not only our family doctor, but he was also Abba's old friend. The doctor was friends with Abba, his sons were friends with my brothers, his daughters-in-law were friends with my sisters-in-law, and the little ones were friends with each other. They would break bread together. The three generations of these two families were so mixed up with each other that there was no hint that the partition of India would impact that love, end quote. Though the politics of looming partition stood far from their minds, the reader is made aware that partition will in fact have an impact on their love for each other by emphasizing that at this point there was no hint. By providing examples from everyday life, Chugtai emphasized the sameness of both families. Quote, far from politics, Amma and Chachi would discuss coriander, turmeric, and their daughters' dowries. The daughters-in-law were busy copying each other's fashion choices, end quote. When the narrator's father, Abba, is paralyzed and eventually dies, it is Rupchand who takes care of their family, making sure the children's school fees are paid and ensuring dowries for the marriages of daughters. Yet things change after partition. The two families grow apart and the narrator's siblings and their families decide to migrate to Pakistan. The narrator's mother, however, refuses to go along with the plan of migration. Quote, only Amma's tongue was mute, not just on that day, but since the 15th of August, when the tricolor was hosted on the roof of Dr. Saab's house and the Muslim League flag on ours. Between those two flags stood a miles-wide desert whose terrifying depth she would look at again and again with her sad eyes, end quote. Amma prefers to stay in the home where she has spent her life, even if it means that she must stay there all alone. When Rupchand sees the children of the narrator's family leave and observes the now empty home across the street, he is devastated. Quote, he was pulling with all his strength at things that had entwined themselves into his very existence, like roots, but it was as if his own flesh was being pulled up along with them, end quote. Reflecting on the title of the story, the pain of separating these interwoven roots is unbearable. Since Rupchand leaves suddenly and by car, the reader might assume that he too is running away from the social trauma of partition. Yet at the end of the story, we learn that he had gone to the train station to convince Amma's family to return. As in Garm Hawa, despite all obstacles, Indian Muslims are exhorted to remain in India, to resist the scorching winds of communal discord and stay in the land of their roots. The question of the place of Muslims in post-partition India is a complicated one, and we've seen the complications of it in the past year or two, even more so. And during the life of Chugtai, it was as well. Her elder sister Azmat's husband was killed during the so-called police action in Hyderabad when the princely state was forcibly integrated into the Indian Union. However, Chugtai's faith in the potential of a cosmopolitan India did not falter. Unlike many of her friends and family members, Chugtai decided to stay in India in 1947. Yet she maintained connections with those in Pakistan and ultimately did visit them. Upon her return from her first trip to Pakistan in 1976, Chugtai wrote, quote, Bombay is calling me, but Karachi appears to hold me back. It seems as if I am traveling from one world to another. How does one cut oneself off from the three brothers who lie buried in the dust of Pakistan? We were born of the same mother. How do I now draw myself away from those who are part of my own flesh and blood, end quote. In spite of the difficulties her family endured at partition, her deceased family members, buried under Pakistani soil, viscerally embodied Chugtai's connection to Pakistan as well. By emphasizing flesh and blood, Chugtai reiterated the significance of the human without reference to the borders and religious identities that separate these human bodies. To Chugtai, South Asia is itself a type of flesh and blood homeland, and the roots discussed in her film and in her stories and films are deep, both within India and Pakistan. So those are kind of my formal prepared remarks about the film and the context and how it fits into Chugtai's broader works and that of the progressive writers more broadly. But it's a difficult film to watch, and I think any of the students who saw it, especially in the current context of the politics around Muslim identity in India, it really is quite difficult to be optimistic, but somehow, despite all odds, Chugtai's work is able to find that optimism in action, in protest, in solidarity, And that to me does seem like the only possible answer for optimism. And it's interesting. So my name is Sadaf Jaffer, and there's a Sadaf Jaffer in India who, was actually arrested in Lucknow during the protest last year, and and she was beaten, and she just happened to be standing. She was on Facebook Live, just standing there, and you see the police come and kind of arrest her. And one could imagine that she would become totally disillusioned with the Indian political system after having that experience of being imprisoned without cause and beaten in prison, and just the terrifying experiences that some Muslim families especially were going through in many places, but including in Lucknow, where I happened to live for 2 years. And I know that Sadaf Jaffer because she's the sister of one of the host families that hosts a lot of American students. And but I just recently saw her again being involved in activism, going to protests, participating in the political system. So it just seems like that's really the only option that people see is engagement. And I think that there are a lot of similarities between that and then my political work here. And I know that the questions that some of the students prepared are related to that political work here in the US as well. And there can be some similarities in terms of minorities feeling as though they're seen to be outside of the narrative of what a true American is. And you can see some similarities to that in India, who fits into the idea of who a true Indian is. And there actually are a lot of similarities in terms of illegal status and documentation, and those without documentation in the US, and then demands for documentation status, and the rise of terms like the illegal Bangladeshi in India, for example. So there are quite a lot of similarities. But I would say in the United States as well, what I have found, my solution has been engagement and participation in protests and participation in the political process. And I don't think it's a coincidence that my research happens to be on the progressive writers movement and focused on Isma Chugtai, because she certainly is kind of an inspiration for me when I think about what motivates my work, my political work. And that's why I find engaging with her thought very, very rich and motivating, and I never get bored of it. So for students who are thinking about doing PhDs, that's what I would say. Pick a topic that you will never get bored of, because you will be working on it for a while. So I think that will probably just conclude my formal remarks, and then we can maybe open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that context. I can't think of a more perfect person to talk about Garm Hawa. So I just want to thank you so much for coming tonight, Sadaf, and also for all of our students and participants. Thank you for coming. If you did not watch the movie beforehand and you would like to watch Garm Hawa, which hopefully after tonight you definitely want to, if you have not watched it, in the registration link that was sent to you for tonight's discussion, there's a link to the film. So if you want to watch it again with that context, or if you want to watch it for the first time or share it with folks, it's available there. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful Thursday evening.